This is 20 Pages a Week, and I am your host, Hal Hammons. We are on a journey reading all the way through the Bible this year. Thanks for coming along. This week's reading is Genesis 1 through 25. Joining us for the discussion today are Phillip Martin from Sharpsburg, Georgia, and Michael Walls from Killeen, Texas. If you don't know about Phillip's Facebook podcast that he does with Terry Francis, Do the Work, do yourself a favor, check it out. It drops Tuesday mornings at 11 Eastern, 10 Central. I hope that is all correct. Gentlemen, thanks for coming along. We're reading Genesis 1 through 25. Let's start with our first impressions.
Go ahead, Phil.
Go ahead, okay. Well, I particularly love the first 5 books of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. They're really exciting to me. And Genesis in particular contains, in many ways, the seeds, really, that the rest of the Bible grows from. I think it's just really powerful to see each of those things kind of come to their full picture. God constantly pulls from those initial interactions between humanity and divinity and uses that to teach us. So every time I read through it, I'm super excited about it.
That's one garden reference for Phil.
I didn't know. Oblique.
We need our signs. Where's Terry?
There we go.
Oblique references.
Michael, what do you have?
Well, of course, I agree with Phil there. As I was reading this whole section, and maybe I'm overlapping into another section we're going to talk about. I keep thinking of mercy. And so actually a Psalm 145:7 came to mind. The Lord is good to all, and his mercy is over all time he has made, and all things he has made, and so I'm reading this story, or several stories, this section, which encompasses a ridiculous amount of time, but every time you see God interacting with the people, God's stepping back from what he could do, maybe even what he should do, and saying, you know what, I'm going to give you another chance. I love you. I'm going to help you. And so, in too many ways to talk about here, he's bringing it back to what his purpose is, which is to save us, just to help us.
Absolutely. I'm sure that'll come up probably in the stories. The way that we're going to do this, I was about to say, for those of you who are new, we're all new, including the 3 people you're looking at. But we're going to cover first impressions, and then we're each going to talk about, or the 2 guests anyway, are going to talk about a story that they get from the text. This is singularly difficult given Genesis 1 through 25 because there's so many to choose from. Later on, we'll get to a place where it's difficult to find a story, but we got plenty to choose from here. Michael, what were you thinking about?
In terms of stories?
Yes.
I am all over the Babel story in chapter 11. It's fascinated me for my entire life. Of course, one problem is we don't have a ton of detail, but again, the mercy element comes into play as the people have not spread out, right? They've gathered in this one area, and they're building this humongous structure, and they're trying to enlighten themselves. And, I don't know if they're really thinking about getting to heaven or exactly what they're doing, but they're going to be great, and they're going to be powerful. And God recognizes that. And they're not doing what he commanded, which was to spread out, fill the earth, and sort of take command of everything. And so, and there's this plurality of God in this section too, like there is in the beginning. And they say, oh, well, we'll confuse everybody. But I read that, and I think there's a whole lot going on. Again, God could have just zapped them, and doesn't. He just confuses them, spreads them out. I think there's more going on. I associate this also with Peleg, which you read about him in chapter. I think you mentioned this in the text here that you gave us, which is great stuff, by the way. Those of you that maybe haven't got onto it yet, yes, Hal put together this wonderful material to get you thinking. And so here's Peleg, who's mentioned in chapter 10 in this genealogy, and the earth was divided during his time. And I don't know if Hal's on this or not, but I'm really into the idea that that's a real physical kind of earthly separation, like some pretty cataclysmic things. I also associate that with Job and some of the things maybe that happened in Job. So I kind of set Job right here too. So this whole story fascinates me, and God just changes one thing which is language, and that then creates, I mean, I'm into culture, I'm into literature, I'm into all these different things. So that story really just always stands out as kind of the beginning now of this, of bringing everyone back to God, right? So I know we're going to go from this point and focus on Abraham and his family and Israel, but you still come back here and see God still taking care of these people and concerned about these people. And again, showing mercy to these people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's, at least from my perspective, the Tower of Babel is super exciting. It's not like necessarily the exciting text for me, but
right.
It does demonstrate really clearly how a single shift in a detail can change the entire outcome for an individual, a person, but also our perception of things. And I think a lot of Genesis as a text is clouded by our perceptions.
Right.
Where we see something and then we try to impute ourselves into that situation. And that's, really the conflict of Bible study in some ways is stepping into that text, stepping into that ancient Near East context. And so there's a lot of cool stuff going on. I will comment very briefly and specifically, that the whole Tower of Babel, the scattering of the languages, all of those things tend to get minimized over time. If you look at the conflicts of Israel going beyond the text of Genesis and all the way through the prophets and the conflicts that exist at that point, language still is a key factor in their differences, but it is not a key factor in their attempts to reconcile. They talk about people who do not know the language of God or speak God's language, and we identify, well, that's because they don't speak Hebrew. It's not really that. It's not so they don't speak Aramaic. It's not really that, or Greek. It's not really that either. It's that they don't have a heart that beats in tune with God, and that's God's language, and they've forgotten that. And their earthly language separation really is an outgrowth of that spiritual language separation theologically.
That's a very good point. We don't speak God's language in a metaphorical sense, really, as much or more than we don't speak one another's language. It's an example of God using our tendency toward tribalism against us. That's what brought everybody together at Babel. Presumably, they want to have something in common. They want to be united. They are pushing back against God's plan to distribute and to conquer the whole earth. And so we're gonna create an industry. We're gonna make something for ourselves that wasn't here before. We're gonna build this tower. And the most fanciful and unlikeliest explanation for the tower, but one that grabs my attention, maybe you've heard this before, is this thought that they can build a tower so big, this tower to the heavens, as it were,
right,
that if God came with another flood, even though he said he would not, even if he did, we're going to be able to survive this. We're going to be able to poke out the top, as it were, and conquer any kind of efforts that God is making against us. I think that's highly, highly unlikely, but spiritually speaking, metaphorically speaking, I think that's exactly what they're doing. There is a plan to subvert God's plans for humanity. And God says, okay, well, I'm going to break you up individually here, and the people that you have in common with, they're going to be their own tribe, and the other people, they're going to be their own tribe, and you're going to break up because of this tendency to want to be all together. The very thing that brought them together is what separates them. And I do, by the way, sign on with the whole idea of the Peleg physical separation. A lot of Christian geologists like the idea of aftershocks and after effects. Not that God isn't controlling these things, but if you tear the entire planet up over a period of a year, that's not settled. They haven't gotten everything worked out now. There's still a lot of unsettling in the physical world, and maybe 500 years later, there's another, sudden jostling and takes the world apart physically to facilitate what God has in mind.
Well, I've experienced many earthquakes in California and many, many aftershocks, and it's unsettling, and something, of course, much larger, as you said, would bring about, I think. Again, it makes sense. It seems to fit
And
And
it explains the
yeah,
great evolutionary problem of not only creating a man and a woman at the same time in the same place, but also creating a man and a woman in the same time in the same place in multiple places.
yes.
There's humanity in Southern Europe, and there's humanity in Central Africa, and there's some humanity in the Near East and in China and in Indonesia, all coming around the same time. Well, maybe they arrived around the same time because they were dispersing from the same event.
Yeah, you see the same thing in the animal kingdom with all these different animals and creatures, and how did they get here and there, and they're so far away. And it's really interesting, fascinating stuff to me. But
Mm-hmm.
language is still a problem, right? I mean, even in our own country, these differences in language. I was thinking even in sort of religious circles, there's differences in language. Phil talked about the language of God or the language of the Lord, right? There's different lingos that different even Christian religious groups use. And it's almost like sometimes our group shies away from certain words or terms because it sounds like X or Y, but it does kind of divide us in some ways.
In the judge's context, it'd be called shibboleths, right?
Yes.
Yes. I think also, there's a lot of stuff we don't know about that exists between the space of the picture given of creation, destruction, and rebuilding that takes place in early Genesis and today. A lot of unsolved mysteries. Some things we'll never know, including the diaspora of humanity across the globe. Like, it's hinted at but never explained. And I actually love that tension in the text where it lets us, both by imagination and perspiration, try to connect these ideas in a sensible way, and figure this stuff out. And so you see a lot of that come down. I'll make this quick point. It's also neat to think about the Tower of Babel in a theological concept. And this ties together with what will eventually be my favorite part of the text. And you guys have already hinted at it anyway, so we can go there eventually.
Go.
But if you think about Genesis 1 through 3 in a theological structure of worship to God, you see first in chapters 1 and 2 darkness that goes from disorder to order, and it's laid out in a very purposeful way where there is, in the end, the place which is the Garden of Eden, positioned as the juncture point between the heavenly realm and the earthly realm. And it's at that juncture where you see God and man together, existing with the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the same space. They're together. And now earth reaches high enough to be in contact with the heavens. And that's an optimal state. You could also say that's a temple, because it is. You could also then say that all creation is God's habitation, because it is. That temple picture goes forward. But tying it here to the Tower of Babel, man is making a horrible substitute for that same situation with their tower. They're trying to rebuild a connection with the divine, but in so doing, they get nowhere near that end. And like Icarus, as they get through their hubris high enough, God brings them low. He melts their plans, dissolves them into new things, and you see them again in that same conflict. They are now aware of their rebellion, shamed before God, but also now suffering the consequences of that shame. They're not together. They're now further apart. And their desire, it seems, in their hubris, was to be close to God together. And now they will be far from God, apart. Really cool stuff when you think about those interactions that you see in the text, to me at least.
Oh yeah, the symbolic implications of this section are as compelling, I think, as the straight story. Now,
Yeah.
for those who do not do the work, and who may not understand the backstory here, Michael is a very frequent guest. I'm in the case one or two times I've been a guest on the program, and it's become obvious to everybody who watches and listens that Phillip has a thing about the Garden of Eden. This is
I have a thing. It's
he has
not
a thing.
tacos, but it's close.
We'll call
Yes.
it a good thing, though.
It's not a bad thing. And I'm on the verge of accepting wholeheartedly his philosophy that all good theology begins in the garden. We're assuming that this is the story that he wants to focus on, and I'll be highly disappointed if it's not.
Well, it is a story. And look, all good theology begins in the garden, but so does all bad theology, because there's a great eternal conflict in the garden. And so that's part of the duality of the text. And certainly when you think about what takes place in even just the dialogue between the woman, the serpent, and man, and all of that then falls forward from there. You see this eternal conflict laying itself out. You see answers to questions when you give your space time, the space to think about them in detail and be a careful, considerate read of the text that don't come in other ways until Jesus. Jesus in his conflict with the serpent, which is the devil now by name later in the stories of the scriptures, he's pulling off that same sequence of events all the way back in Genesis when he is in Jerusalem and the devil is testing to see how much he can pull from Jesus and his desire to rule the earthly realm. And so the reason I think of the garden becomes so significant is it sets the stage. It creates the color and backdrop of our spiritual lives for everything that goes forward. And it's an interesting level of conflict. So just kind of narrowing in the story itself, what I'm talking about right now is just really the conversations that take place between the serpent, Eve, and Adam up until the point where God finds them again. And think about just that little box of information. And now think about how we respond to the conflicts in our worlds. So the devil goes to the woman, likely in a group, but hard to tell textually because it's very unclear. We're most likely certain that Adam is there too in this conversation by his actions. He speaks as one who knows, not one who heard.
Right.
And in that, you see the devil, in essence, twisting just enough of the edges to pull her earthward, to pull her out of the spiritual realm, which she can touch in a theological sense because she's in the garden, she is undefiled, and pull her towards his earthly realm. Connect that in your brain to the statements concerning the devil and his fallen state that exists in the New Testament. He's left a heavenly realm. He is identified then as being in an earthly realm. And so he pulls her with him first. And so in her fall, she reaches and grabs him, Adam, and pulls him down as well in this sequence. And so the garden then sets the stage for the devil being hyper concerned with the only realm he has left, excluded from the garden, excluded from the heavenly realms. He pulls all that he can with him in his tight little ball to suffer in his new home. And so that interaction creates the standard by which God then responds. Their curses and their blessings in this garden conversation all reflect the rebellion and reflect course correction. Her curse is to actually now subsist in an environment that would have had her no longer equal, because they're sown as equal in the garden, but now she is not only subservient to her physical condition, pain multiplied in birth, but also in her leadership context. She took the lead. Now she's in the back seat, if you will. And Adam, everything that was easy for him about garden life is now magnified. So his physicality is more kind of ensnaring in that sense. And where he could have risen to a spiritual rescue and said, hey now, we shouldn't do this. Let's go talk to God. Really simple, thimming down of these things. She comes back, and he comes back with, well, let's do it. And so God says, well, your consequence is you are required to wear the burden of leadership. And you are required to be in a space that maybe he doesn't want, because clearly he didn't respond. And that creates the dynamic of earth today. And it all stems from this sense of seeds that are planted. And seeds are a great analogy because A, it is a garden, and B, the conflict points that are kind of placed to are two trees. Tree of life, representing longevity, humanity, immortality, and the tree of knowledge of good or evil. And really, we tend to kind of thin those things down to constructs, but when in reality, they are presented to us as real things in a real space with real relationships. And the broken relationship of the family that God built is the family he doesn't have anymore. And so he takes his son through this story, because he's part of that blessing and curse as well, to bring reconciliation back around on the bottom end. Just a great story that really gets become one of the major biblical themes. You're going to see it in every temple narrative. So anytime there's a temple, Jesus then is found in the midst of a temple that is Eden-like. When you have moments of him in prayer in a garden, kind of really overhandedly obvious, he is fighting a space that gets the context for our minds to go to the garden. It just echoes through the text. That's why it's really exciting. You can't go too far with it, just like you can with any analogy, but it's a pretty strong biblical theme.
You bring up the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. I mean, Jesus comes, when he comes physically here, and he talks about those things. I am those things. Mm-hmm. So the words I am delivering to you are those things. I'm here to give you the words of life, and I'm giving you words of truth, the words of truth. It's pretty amazing how it all comes back together, as you said.
I was thinking about you, Philip, a week or so ago when I was preparing a sermon. A turn of phrase during the curse of man grabbed me like it hadn't before. I talked to Michael about this, I think, the other day. The choice that humanity makes, the Adam and Eve make, of physical things over spiritual things, choosing to abandon the garden. God has allowed them to live in paradise, and they can live with him there forever if they want to. Or you can choose the things of the ground. You can choose the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eye and the pride of life. And when God curses the earth and makes man, live by the sweat of his brow, that's akin to basically handing him a shovel and saying, okay, start digging your hole. And you commit yourself to the earth, and you're in the earth, and you're getting deeper and deeper. And the more you live in the earth, the more you become part of the earth and surrounded by the earth. This is the choice that you have made. And at the end of the day, you put your shovel down and you lie down in the bottom of the pit and you die. That's your choice that you have made. You've chosen to live in the earth, and now you're part of the earth. And God didn't want it that way. God gives us an option. And again, going to the Jesus analogy that you talked about there, we can get back to the garden. We can get back to the tree of life if we will reverse that choice, if we'll make a better choice than Adam made in the flesh.
Well, it's almost like, again, we brought this up the other day, it's almost like God then sort of steps back, right? He delivers the curse. And I'm certainly not saying God was gone, because we have the story of Enoch and some other things. We know people started calling on the name of the Lord, and so Babel. But it's almost like he steps back, lets that play out, as you say, digging. And then in chapter 6, he says, everybody's evil. It's like Romans 1, right? Everyone's turned over to their carnal desires, except he finds Noah. So there's mercy again, but he wipes the slate clean. And then he and this is just me thinking about it, he steps back into the picture with Noah, and then of course Abraham, and then we have this, the plan, if you will, really sort of begins to unfold as we know it. And we have hindsight; we're able to see the whole picture. It's pretty obvious, but it feels like, to use your digging analogy, that's kind of what happened. He let them go until it was over, and they did it to themselves.
If you want to have one more layer, you could think about the welcoming father and the prodigal son, and that departure and return as emblematic of humanity leaving and returning to the garden in the overall picture of Genesis to the end of Revelation. I think there's a lot of that picture kind of unfurling.
If only the father had had a vegetable garden for the brother to work in, that would have made the analogy perfect. Let's move on. One verse. If there was one verse that grabs your attention more than any other for whatever reason, what would that verse be?
Oh, for me, it's really easy. Genesis 1:1. It's the one that just totally rattles everything else. It opens the greatest story of stories. So, like in the Scriptures, Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible in particular, but you see it in the New Testament as well. You see these doubles, where it's Song of Songs. That means it's the greatest song of all songs. And then you have Holy of Holies. It's the most holy of holy spaces. Well, Genesis 1:1 starts the story of stories. And so when it opens up with such atonement that you cannot help but hear either James Earl Jones or some other great baritone voice reading it to you, Alexander Scutherby, who was a great reader, not the same tonal depth, but you just like, okay, Morgan Freeman, tell me what's going on. And in the beginning, God created. Like, it just resonates to me on both a personal level, but then a narrative level, and then on a spiritual high every time.
How about the beginning of the beginnings? The beginning of humanity, the beginning of the world, the beginning of worship, the beginning of all of these things. I believe Genesis 1:1 is the most important verse in the Bible. If you believe that, you set yourself up for believing everything else. If you don't believe that, then it's just a book. It's just a different story.
How do you go anywhere else if you can't believe that that spot? And you have to start there. Otherwise, it's all a waste of time.
Michael, you're not wrong if you picked a different verse.
I did. I can't argue with that verse, of course, but I find myself, as I'm preaching or as I'm talking to people or as I'm thinking about things, going back to Genesis 4 and verse 7, where God's having that conversation with Cain after they offer the sacrifice, and Cain's angry, right? Cain's was not acceptable. We know from Hebrews, it wasn't by faith, and therefore it wasn't acceptable. So we make some assumptions about that, but whatever it was, he didn't do what God asked him to do, and he's mad about it. And God says, if you do well, it'll be fine. But if you don't, sin lies at the door, and so on. And so I go back to that verse as a sort of this, and I mean, we have Adam and Eve in the garden, but this is like post-garden. We're in the real world now, and this is how God interacts with people. And he says, all you got to do is listen. Right? All you've got to do is just do the right thing. We say that to our kids. Maybe we preach it some. And again, this comes back to mercy. Later in the story, right? He kills Abel because he's so angry, and God doesn't kill him. God grants him life. He exiles him, and he complains about it. And so he grants him this mark so that he won't be killed. So I read this passage every time, and I'm seeing two elements: my choice, and the mercy of God working together to give a real sense of what everyone's life is like, what everyone's responsibility is, what everyone's choice is. And we can argue all day long up and down about grace and the million different versions of grace that some Calvinists and others want to try to portray. But here it is. God says, if you do the right things, it'll be all right. And that's it. I mean, that's exactly what we tell our kids, I hope, right? Every day. And we don't expect that perfection from them. We expect, them to try. We expect devotion and those sorts of things. We don't expect them to be completely perfect. And if they do that, they're great.
We covered the Cain and Abel story Wednesday night here with the local church. And we want, I think the way that I have always looked at Cain and Abel is that there's a good guy and there's a bad guy, and you want to be the good guy. And that's valid. There's nothing wrong with that. If you want to follow Abel's example of worship, that's great. But I think the main story here is the Cain story. Mm-hmm. That we are in Cain's spot here because all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. It's not about whether you can be a good guy or a bad guy. It's about what happens when you're caught being a bad guy. You have an opportunity to go back. You have an opportunity to learn from your mistake if you want to, or you can become resentful. You can become bitter. You can lash out at God. You can lash out at your brother or whatever. You make a good choice early in your path down the wrong road. You can course correct and come back. That's 1 John 1 verse 7, right? You're walking in the light of season light. That's good. But you're going to step off that path sometimes. And that's okay. It's not good, but it's not the end of the world. You can course correct and come back. That's what Cain has a chance to do here. Sin crouches at the door. You can say no to sin. You can slam the door in the face of sin. Right. And next week we'll have exhibit A of what happens when you do slam the door in the face of sin. Joseph pays a very steep penalty for this, but he has an opportunity to either go down this wrong road or not. And there are serious consequences for it, but he's able to do it, and he's blessed because of that. Cain doesn't do that. And his entire line, from then on, for right or wrong, I'm sure there are decent people in Cain's line, but he characterizes evil in the world after this, because this is the course he's chosen, and he stayed on that course.
Yeah, and I think this just underscores the issue of free will. A lot of people want to take it out. I guess that's comforting. Wouldn't it be easy if we didn't have free will and we just, it was either automatic or God chose, predestined, some of those other kinds of theologies, but free will is ingrained and made into us. But as Phil said about Adam, all Adam had to do was say, you know what, we're not doing that. Let's go talk to God. All Cain had to do was say, you're right. Here's the real sacrifice. Yeah. And then no problem.
I think it's neat. Also, that verse there, it's a difficult verse to translate when you listen to people who are much more technically skilled in the language. They talk about the complexities of what's actually going on there. But I really love the duality of those complications. On one level, people talk about it, it's all about his spiritual relationship to God. But on the other level, it's all about how he sees himself. And I kind of live in the space that says, why can't we have both? That both of those are going to be the key.
Sure.
But it does answer the common concern that a lot of folks have today. What about my self-worth? What about my self-image? What about my self-realization? Like, how do I feel about myself? And if you think about it on that earthly edge, when it talks about why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? The other way to render that text is, will not your countenance rise? Will not your head lift up? Because if you perceive Cain as now inwardly frustrated because God didn't accept his offering, and God turns to him and says, it's going to be okay. It's going to be all right. But Cain won't accept that. He's crippled by the chaos and the chains that he has kind of ensnared himself in. And God's saying, look, all you've got to do is look up to me, and everything's going to be okay. I think that's something that really is lacking in general culture, is the spiritual impact of that simple shift of letting God forgive and us accepting God's forgiveness that comes through Cain. Because Cain's line includes people that are spiritually worthy. It's a great turn of the hat to think about some of his descendants, but he typifies obstinate rebellion to the end.
All right. Well, tell you what, let's move on from that point. Thank you very much for that conversation, and we will discuss now the one verse, or we talk about one verse, the one word. If there is a word that characterizes this this passage, what would that word be?
I kind of want to hear yours first, Hal.
My word?
Yes.
Well, my word, I don't want to, I've been thinking about grace a lot, and it's been touched on already, the idea that, and going back to what Phillip was just saying a second ago, this isn't about being perfect. This is about being willing to learn. This is about being willing to stay the course. It's very much like training a child. God's training his children. You messed up. That's okay. It's not good, but it's not the end of the world either. If you learn from your mistake, you move on, you receive grace. God looks upon you with favor. Anyway, you're his child. Why wouldn't he look upon you with favor? But we are determined to prove ourselves, like the 6-year-old, like the 12-year-old, who is convinced in his mind, convinced in her mind, that their path is right, that they did it right. They were correct. And mom and dad speak from the voice of authority and say, no, you weren't correct. You messed up. You could have done better. No, I couldn't have done better. I'm incapable of doing better, or I'm right and you're wrong. It tends more toward that second one, probably, as the child gets into teenage years. But that's what salvation by works is all about. I am good enough. Don't tell me I'm not good enough. And when we give that up, and we allow God to save us, we allow him to guide us through this process. And you see it in what a wonderful place to find the word grace for the first time in chapter 6. Noah found grace. Was Noah perfect? No, almost certainly not. Well, certainly not. But he was a man of faith. He found grace. God's willing to give grace. And I believe, I don't know how you feel about this, but I believe that Enoch and his child Methuselah were living prophecies. The people who play with the language a little bit can see a prophecy in the name of Methuselah. When he dies, it comes. And Methuselah lives longer than anybody that we know of. God's just extending this and extending this. He shows grace to Enoch by letting him escape Earth about 600 years earlier than he normally would have. But he extends grace to planet Earth by allowing Methuselah to live long, to continue. Once the prophecy finally comes, you get another 120 years, as I read the Genesis chapter 6 anyway. He's showing grace. He's just almost cramming grace down the gullet of humanity. You're going to get grace whether you want it or not. And they just steadfastly refuse to accept it. And finally, all right, if you won't live with me, then you won't live at all.
Yeah, and that stands opposed to the picture people have of God, the God of the Old Testament, so-called, right? He's mean, he's full of wrath and anger and fury. Grace, I go with, the other side of that same coin of mercy, right? As I've already kind of done, probably too much, but the garden itself is grace, it's mercy. When they sin, what's the penalty? Death. We always say, well, spiritual death. I think it was death, and God said, you know what? I'm going to hold that off, and I'm going to just kick you out, and we're going to start this other process, because he could have just snuffed it out right there. Cain, as I already said, the same thing. He doesn't kill him. He punishes him, but he gives him mercy. And then you go to Noah, and even though God does destroy the entire earth as we know it, there's mercy there in continuing the line of humanity, right? And moving on. And then the rainbow after the flood, and the rainbow says, I'm not doing this again. And he kind of lifts some of the curses, right? And then Babel, as we mentioned before, he doesn't wipe them out. I mean, we know there's times where God's like, I'm done, and he just doesn't do it. And you go to Abraham, and he picks Abraham because Abraham's faithful already. And then this child of promise, it's another mercy to give a child to someone that doesn't have one and can't have one. So there's grace, and I know those are somewhat different things, but then you get the child of promise, but then through that, this promise to the whole world, right? To bless the whole world. And then Hagar and Ishmael, as they try to circumvent God's plans. Mercy on Hagar and Ishmael. We were talking about this the other day, right? God saw the fix. We're reading from this, the Message translation. God saw the fix that Ishmael was in, which just blows my mind that God spoke in Southern English, I guess. But he gives mercy to this kid who's not the child of promise, but because of what he told Abraham, mercy. And then so on. The sacrifice and the ram and the whole story that unfolds there in chapter 22. It just on and on and on and on. And just in these first 25 chapters, it's everywhere.
Yeah. It's all over the place. I guess for me, I struggled with this a little bit, trying to figure out which word is going to be the word for me. And initially, I was living in the space of beginnings, but then I said, I'm not really. That's not really what really thinking the most about lately. And then I thought about creation, which is a form of that. And there's 3 Hebrew words that are there: bara, asa, and yatsar. But I decided, that's not really the thing that strikes me the most, because I came back to the word for me is image, and specifically from the text wherein God has recorded for us, let us make man in our image. And I want to make a little bit of a point as to why I think that's so important. From the plurality of God, let us make man. He makes a plurality of humanity, that in order for us to replicate, we have to have the fullness of humanity on the other end of the scale to make equivalent the text. So on first level look, male and female are defined for us as being the full picture of what's necessary to match whatever it is that God is saying with let us make man in our image. It is only satisfied with the fullness of male and female that's further delineated in the following passages. But even more so in the post-diaspora, post-flood, post-Babel context, it's only fully satisfied when all of humanity flows back into the kingdom. And all the little simple songs and memory verses, that talk about the differences of humanity that can be found in the kingdom. Only when that comes to its fullness do you see that balance flowing to its full intention. So the image of man is only reflected when all of man is on its edge of the table, just as God exists on his edge of the fulcrum of that passage. And so I think image, for me, at least in this year, is a great word from Genesis to help me better understand God's purposes. I need the entire kingdom. I need the scruffy nerf herders, and I need every inch in between that point and beyond. And I'm saying I live in the scruffy nerf herder world. That's kind of where I tend to exist, and everybody else is elsewhere. That's kind of what we need to have what God wants from us.
When they have that conversation, Jesus and the questioner about the rich young ruler, about what good thing must I do? And Jesus says, no one is good except God. And we have this big conversation, which I guess could be another word, maybe for another time, the idea of good. In the purest Bible sense, good is what God makes. Things are good when they are according to God's plan. When God looks at the world and says, behold, it was very good, what he means by that is, this is what I wanted, including and particularly humanity, because it's humans' addition to the equation that makes it very good, as opposed to just good. Mankind is where it needs to be. Mankind is, in the fullest sense, as much as can be in the flesh anyway, in the fullest sense, in the image of God. And we make short work of that. We get rid of that pretty quick. But the rest of the Bible, the other 65.95% of the text is about getting back there, getting back to the image of God, getting back to where God wants us to be.
And I think Phil's point about the fullness of humanity is important. It's important for us now. One, we always talk about souls are important. Everybody's souls that are important. We need to be careful about making judgments about people's soul in terms of who we're willing to speak to or not. But even in this, kind of crazy political climate here in the United States right now, we need to step back and remember we're all God's people. We're all God's creation, and we're all made in God's image. And it's way beyond, black and white and everything in between. It's Republican and Democrat and everything in between. And it's all these different groups. Now, of course, truth needs to reign. Of course, that should go without saying. But we need to remember that we cannot write any of those people off who are in even just complete disagreement with us or even with Scripture.
Yeah, I think to kind of tie a point that Michael has made, and I know that Hal echoed, in this text of Genesis, God keeps giving us opportunity for reconciliation, in part, I think, because we live in a world that has been made bad. It's opportunity for grace to revolve in our experiences and to have that cycle of outcome of grace received, grace extended, grace reciprocated, in a world that says grace doesn't matter. And in fact, being gracious is equivalent to weakness in large parts of humanity. And one of the reminders I keep telling myself to really try to make sure my focus is in the right space is the kingdom sees kingdoms of men as Babylon. And if I can remember that, it doesn't matter where Babylon's address is today, whether it is Washington, D.C., whether it is in Moscow, whether it is in London, it doesn't matter, because the Bible consistently shows the earthly nations as Babylon, and even Israel becomes Babylon. And yet the deeply political message of Jesus is, my kingdom is not of this world, and his kingdom concepts are all garden-based principles. Think about the Sermon on the Mount. It's a full-on exposition of the real theology of God.
It's all about choosing heaven over the earth. And going back to the themes of grace and works that we were talking about before, paradise versus earth. Jesus calls Satan 3 times in that last conversation with his disciples, the prince of this world. When you choose the earth, you're choosing the devil. It's not about finding the best manifestation of political correctness or decency or whatever. It's about choosing God's world over this world. And I fear, this is soapbox number one to me these days, I fear that we have gotten so used to looking at America as the source of the world's problems, as the source of the world's solutions to problems, maybe the problems too, I don't know. But if we could just get the right guy elected or whatever, the problem is not America. The problem is not the Democrats, the Republicans. The problem is the devil, and there's no way that you can escape that except by escaping planet Earth, choosing Eden instead of choosing the earth. Quit working your way towards salvation, however you may define salvation, and accept God's grace. Allow him to give you what he wants to give you rather than making something for yourself.
Yeah. What's the answer and solution to all that? Do what Paul said. Strap up, put the armor on, and go. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. That's it.
Excellent. All right. Well, our time is up. Thank you very much, Phillip and Michael, for joining me today. Thanks always to Jerry Tesh and the fellows at Narrow Way for providing music in our intro. Check them out at www.narrowway.com. Be reading Genesis 26 through 50 for next time. And check out my other podcast, Citizen of Heaven. If you like what you're hearing, like, subscribe, and especially share. Until then, this is Hal Hammons, and we'll see you next week. Read your Bible.
This is my Father's world. The battle is not done. Jesus who died shall be satisfied.